Blood and chrome don't usually mix with tears and schoolyard bullies. When a trembling 7-year-old boy clutched the heavy leather vest of a fully patched Hell's Angel and begged, "Can you pretend to be my dad?" Nobody expected the roar of 40 V-twin engines to be the answer. The rain was coming down in sheets over Oildale, California, turning the asphalt of Route 99 into a slick, black mirror. Inside the neon-lit confines of Rusty's diner, the air smelled of stale coffee, fried onions, and damp wool. Sitting in a corner booth, his back to the wall, was Arthur Dutch Fallon. Dutch was 52, built like a brick outhouse, and wore the unmistakable 3-piece patch of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The winged death head sat dead center on his leather cut, flanked by the red and white Bakersfield bottom rocker. Dutch was a man who lived outside the margins of polite society. He had scars that told stories he'd never speak aloud, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He was halfway through his black coffee when he felt a slight tug on his heavy denim sleeve. Dutch looked down, his hand instinctively dropping toward the heavy buckle of his belt. But it wasn't a threat. It was a kid. The boy couldn't have been older than 7. He was wearing a faded Spider-Man t-shirt that was a size too big, and his sneakers were scuffed. But what caught Dutch's attention wasn't the worn-out clothes. It was the sheer, paralyzing terror in the kid's eyes. Tears were cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. His lower lip was trembling so violently he could barely speak. "Mister," the boy whispered, his voice cracking, "please, can you pretend to be my dad?" Dutch frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together. He looked past the boy and saw a woman huddled 2 booths away. She was in her late 20s, her face pale, frantically trying to make herself as small as possible behind a laminated menu. A purple bruise was blooming along her jawline. "What's your name, kid?" Dutch asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that usually intimidated grown men. "T. Tommy," the boy stammered, his small fingers still gripping the thick leather of Dutch's cut. "He's coming. He's outside. He says he's going to take me away from Mum. Please." Before Dutch could ask who he was, the diner's front door chimed. The heavy glass door swung open, letting in a gust of cold, wet wind. A man stepped inside. He was tall, wearing a tailored grey suit that cost more than the waitress made in a month. He had the clean-cut, arrogant swagger of a man who owned the room. But Dutch noticed the telltale bulge beneath the man's left armpit, a shoulder holster. Dutch glanced at the mother. She had completely frozen, her eyes wide with a familiar, suffocating panic. A biker's instinct. Dutch didn't need a police report to understand the dynamic in the room. He knew predators when he saw them, and the man in the suit had the scent of a predator who used a badge to hide his sins. "Sit down, Tommy," Dutch said quietly, sliding over in the vinyl booth. "You like pancakes?" Tommy nodded, his eyes darting towards the front door. "Then sit. And eat." Dutch handed the boy a piece of bacon from his plate. The man in the suit scanned the diner, his eyes locked onto the mother, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He started walking toward her booth, his leather shoes clicking against the linoleum. But as he passed Dutch's table, he finally noticed Tommy. "Well, well," the man said, stopping in his tracks. "There you are, you little brat. Get up, you're coming with me. Your mother and I have things to discuss." Tommy shrank back, pressing himself against Dutch's massive arm. Dutch didn't move. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, set the mug down on the saucer, and finally looked up. "Excuse me," Dutch said, the silence in the diner suddenly deafening. "You're interrupting my breakfast with my son." The man in the suit blinked, caught completely off guard. He looked at Dutch, taking in the heavy beard, the tattoos crawling up his neck, and the Hells Angels patch, and let out a short, dismissive laugh. Your son? The man sneered. Listen, Trash, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm Detective Ray Mitchell, Kern County Narcotics. That boy is my stepson, and I'm taking him. Mitchell reached into his jacket, resting his hand casually near his holster, a classic intimidation tactic. Dutch didn't flinch. He slowly wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, leaned forward, and locked eyes with the detective. I don't care if you're the Pope, Dutch said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the lethal calm of a coiled rattlesnake. The boy said I'm his dad today, and since he's sitting at my table, eating my bacon, that makes him mine. Now, you can turn around and walk out that door, or we can see how fast that badge melts when things get hot. The diner was dead silent. The grill cook had stopped scraping the flat top. The waitress was standing frozen behind the counter. Mitchell's face flushed crimson. He was used to civilians cowering. He wasn't used to staring down a patched member of the world's most notorious motorcycle club, a man who clearly had absolutely nothing to lose. You're interfering with police business, Mitchell hissed, though he took a half step back. I have a court order for custody. Tomorrow is the father-son breakfast at West Park Elementary. I'll be there to take him, officially. If you or his whore of a mother try to stop me, I'll have you both locked up. Mitchell glared at Tommy. Enjoy the pancakes, kid. I'll see you tomorrow at 8 a.m. With a final disgusted look at Dutch, the detective turned and walked out into the rain. The second the door closed, Tommy's mother rushed over, collapsing into the booth opposite Dutch. She pulled Tommy into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. I'm sorry, she wept, looking at Dutch with a mixture of terror and immense gratitude. I'm so sorry to involve you. My name is Elena. Ray, he used his connections to get full custody. He beats us, but the local judges play golf with him. He told me if I didn't hand Tommy over tomorrow at the school event, he'd plant drugs in my car and make sure I go to prison. Dutch sat back, processing the information. The Hells Angels had a complicated relationship with the law, but there was a universal code among the Brotherhood. You don't mess with kids, and you despise a dirty cop who uses his power to abuse the weak. West Park Elementary? Dutch asked quietly. Elena nodded, wiping her eyes. Yes. The school is hosting a big outdoor breakfast. Ray wants to make a public show of taking Tommy away from me there, to humiliate me. Tommy doesn't have a father. Ray thinks it's a joke. Tommy, still clutching his half-eaten bacon, looked up at Dutch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battered plastic army man. He slid it across the table toward the biker. Thank you for being my dad today, Tommy whispered. Dutch stared at the small green toy. He thought about his own son, who he had lost to a drunk driver 10 years ago. The pain of that loss was an open wound that had never truly healed. He picked up the plastic soldier, his massive, calloused fingers dwarfing the toy, and slipped it into his leather vest pocket. Listen to me, Elena, Dutch said, his voice firm but surprisingly gentle. You take Tommy to that school tomorrow. You hold your head up high. Elena looked terrified. But Ray will be there. I know, Dutch replied, throwing a $20 bill onto the table. He slid out of the booth and stood up to his full 6'3" height. Tommy asked me to pretend to be his dad. I don't break promises to kids. Dutch walked out into the rain, swung a leg over his customized Harley-Davidson diner, and kicked the engine to life. He didn't ride home. He rode straight to the fortified clubhouse on the edge of town. When Dutch walked into the main room, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of a pool game. Sitting at the head of a massive oak table was Big Jim Lawson, the president of the Bakersfield Charter. Dutch walked up to the table and slammed his fist down, rattling the empty beer bottles. Jim, Dutch said, the fire burning fiercely in his eyes. "I need to call a church meeting. Right now. We have a ride tomorrow morning, and we're going to an elementary school." The atmosphere inside the Bakersfield Hells Angels clubhouse was thicker than the cigar smoke hanging in the rafters. The main hall, usually a place of raucous laughter, clinking beer bottles, and heavy rock music, was dead silent. 40 patched members sat around the massive oak table and lined the wood-panelled walls. They were men carved from rough stone, mechanics, construction workers, and outlaws, wearing their road-worn leathers like armor. Dutch stood at the head of the table, directly to the right of Big Jim Lawson, the club president. Big Jim was a towering figure with a silver beard that reached his chest and arms, thick with faded prison ink. He listened intently as Dutch recounted the scene at Rusty's diner. Dutch didn't leave a single detail out. The bruises on Elena's face, the arrogant swagger of Detective Ray Mitchell, and most importantly, the sheer, paralyzing terror of a 7-year-old boy holding a plastic army man. When Dutch finished speaking, he took the small, green plastic toy out of his pocket and set it softly on the scarred oak table. It stood there, a tiny, fragile symbol in a room full of hardened giants. "The cop thinks he owns the town," Dutch said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that echoed off the walls. "He's using his badge to beat on a woman and terrorize a kid. He told the boy he's taking him tomorrow at the West Park Elementary father-son breakfast. The kid asked me to be his dad. I told him I would." Big Jim stared at the plastic soldier for a long, heavy moment. The silence stretched, tense and expectant. Finally, the president leaned back in his heavy leather chair, the wood creaking under his massive frame. He looked around the room, making eye contact with every single brother present, from Iron Mike Sullivan, the sergeant-at-arms, to Bones Harrison, the newest patch holder. "We've got a lot of history with the Kern County Sheriff's Department," Big Jim rumbled, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. "Some good, mostly bad. But a badge doesn't give a man the right to put his hands on a mother. And it sure as hell doesn't give him the right to break a kid's spirit." Big Jim stood up, picking up the plastic army man and handing it back to Dutch. "Tomorrow morning, 7:30 a.m., Big Jim announced, his voice suddenly sharp and commanding. "Kickstands up. We wear full patches. We ride in formation. And we show this dirty detective what a real family looks like. Anyone who has a problem with that, speak now." Not a single man moved. Then Iron Mike slammed his heavy silver rings against the table. "I'm in," he grunted. Within seconds, a chorus of heavy boots stomping the floorboards and fists pounding the table filled the room. The vote was unanimous. The next morning broke with crisp, clear California sunshine, entirely ignorant of the storm that was about to hit West Park Elementary. The school's athletic field had been transformed into a picturesque suburban dream. Checkered plastic tablecloths draped over folding tables, orange juice chilled in large plastic coolers, and the air smelled of maple syrup and freshly cut grass. Fathers in polo shirts, khaki shorts, and neatly pressed suits stood in small clusters, drinking bad coffee from styrofoam cups and boasting about their golf handicaps. Children chased each other around the perimeter, their laughter ringing through the morning air. Standing near the edge of the playground, completely isolated from the cheerful crowd, was Eleanor. She held Tommy's hand so tightly, her knuckles were white. The bruises on her face were clumsily hidden beneath thick layers of foundation, but the absolute dread in her eyes couldn't be concealed. Tommy was wearing a freshly ironed button-down shirt, nervously kicking the dirt with his scuffed sneakers. He kept looking toward the street, searching the passing minivans and sedans. "He's coming, Mum," Tommy whispered, his voice shaking. He promised. Elena swallowed hard, fighting back tears. She knelt down and hugged her son. Oh, sweetie. People like that. They don't mean to break their promises, but they have their own lives. We just have to be strong. Just you and me, okay? Well, isn't this a touching scene? The sneering voice cut through the air like a rusty blade. Detective Ray Mitchell strutted across the grass, holding 2 plates of pancakes. He wore a sharp navy suit, his badge clipped ostentatiously to his belt next to his service weapon. He smiled, but the warmth never reached his cold, dead eyes. The nearby parents gave him respectful nods, completely unaware of the monster lurking beneath the tailored wool. "Ray, please," Elena begged quietly, stepping in front of Tommy. "Don't do this here. Don't make a scene in front of his friends." "I'm not making a scene, Elena," Mitchell mocked, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm just a loving stepfather here to exercise my legal, court-ordered rights. The judge signed the papers at 10 p.m. last night. Full temporary custody pending investigation. You really shouldn't have associated with biker trash, Elena. It makes you look like an unfit mother." He reached out and forcefully grabbed Tommy by the shoulder. The boy shrieked and tried to pull away, but Mitchell's grip was like an iron vice. "Let him go!" Elena cried out, grabbing Mitchell's arm. Several fathers looked over, their brows furrowed, but Mitchell quickly flashed his badge. "Police business, folks. Just dealing with a domestic custody issue. Nothing to worry about." The fathers quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. Mitchell leaned in close to Eleanor, his breath smelling of stale mints and malice. "I told you I'd break you," he hissed. "Come on, kid, we're leaving." Tommy dug his heels into the grass, tears streaming down his face. He looked desperately toward the street. "Where is he?" the boy sobbed. "He promised." "Nobody is coming to save you, kid," Mitchell laughed darkly. But then the ground began to vibrate. It started as a low, guttural thrumming, a deep bass note that seemed to rattle the styrofoam cups on the folding tables. The fathers stopped talking. The kids stopped running. Even Mitchell paused, loosening his grip slightly on Tommy's shoulder. The thrumming grew louder, building into a deafening, mechanical roar that echoed off the brick walls of the school building. It sounded like a rolling earthquake. Around the corner of Elm Street, a solitary motorcycle appeared. It was a massive, custom-built Harley-Davidson, gleaming with chrome and matte black paint. Riding it was Arthur Dutch Fallon, his leather cut flapping slightly in the wind, the Hells Angels' death head patch catching the morning sun. But Dutch wasn't alone. Behind him, riding 2 abreast in perfect disciplined formation, was a river of heavy American iron. 5 bikes, 10, 20. 40 heavily customized motorcycles roared down the quiet suburban street, an overwhelming tidal wave of leather, denim, beards, and thunder. The convoy turned into the school parking lot, engines revving, exhaust pipes spitting defiance. The PTA mums gasped, clutching their pearls. The suburban dads took several nervous steps back. This was the raw, unfiltered, dangerous edge of society crashing directly into their pristine world. Dutch kicked his stand down and killed his engine. Behind him, 39 other engines cut off in near-perfect unison. The sudden silence that followed was heavier and more intimidating than the roar of the exhaust. 40 men dismounted. They moved with a calm, deliberate purpose. Big Jim, Iron Mike, Bones, and the rest of the Brotherhood formed a massive wall behind Dutch as he unhooked his heavy chain wallet and began walking across the grass directly toward Detective Mitchell. The crowd parted for the bikers like the Red Sea. Nobody breathed. Tommy's tear-streaked face lit up with an incandescent joy. He ripped his shoulder out of Mitchell's loosened grip and ran as fast as his little legs could carry him. "Dad!" Tommy yelled at the top of his lungs. Dutch dropped to one knee, catching the boy in his massive, tattooed arms. He lifted Tommy off the ground, holding him tight against his leather vest. "Hey, son," Dutch said softly, loud enough for the terrified crowd to hear. "Sorry I'm late. Hit some traffic." Mitchell's face cycled through shock, confusion, and finally, a deep, humiliated rage. He instinctively dropped his hand to the butt of his service weapon. "You step away from that boy," Mitchell barked, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure of 40 sets of cold, calculating eyes staring him down. "You have no legal right to be here. I am a sworn officer of the law, and I have a judge's order." Dutch slowly stood up, keeping Tommy safely tucked behind his massive frame. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet menace radiating from the men behind him was enough to freeze the blood in Mitchell's veins. "A judge's order." Big Jim stepped forward, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the detective. "That's funny. We brought our own paperwork." From the back of the pack of bikers stepped a man who didn't fit in at all. He wasn't wearing leather. He was wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase. This was Harvey the Shark Sterling, the most feared defense attorney in Kern County. The club paid him a small fortune on retainer, and he was worth every penny. Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and walked right up to Mitchell, who suddenly looked very pale. "Detective Ray Mitchell," Sterling said pleasantly, opening his briefcase. "I represent Mr. Fallon, the club, and as of 6 a.m. this morning, Ms. Elena Jenkins. I hold here an emergency federal injunction signed by a federal circuit judge in Los Angeles just 3 hours ago." Mitchell blinked. "Federal? What are you talking about?" "It seems my clients are very resourceful," Sterling smiled thinly, pulling out a thick stack of photographs and documents. "Last night, while you were sleeping, a few of Mr. Fallon's associates took a ride down to your lockup facility. They found the locker where you've been stashing the narcotics you skimming from evidence. They also took a ride to see 3 of your former confidential informants, who were more than happy to sign sworn affidavits regarding your extortion racket in exchange for our protection." Mitchell staggered back a step, the color completely drained from his face. The suburban dads and PTA mums were whispering frantically now, the illusion of the noble detective entirely shattered. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mitchell stammered, his hand shaking. "You planted that. This is intimidation." "No, detective," Sterling corrected smoothly. "Intimidation is what you did to this woman and child. What we are doing is executing the law. If you look behind you, you'll see we didn't just bring bikers." Mitchell spun around. Pulling into the parking lot with their lights flashing silently were 3 black SUVs. Men in windbreakers bearing the letters FBI stepped out, accompanied by 2 officers from the Kern County Internal Affairs Division. Big Jim had made a call last night, all right. He had called a federal prosecutor who owed the club a massive favor for a tip that had dismantled a rival cartel operation years ago. The Hells Angels didn't just use muscle, they used leverage, and they had gathered enough leverage on Mitchell overnight to bury him under a federal prison for 20 years. "Detective Mitchell," the lead IA officer called out, walking across the grass with handcuffs already unclipped. "We need your badge and your weapon, right now. You're under arrest for corruption, evidence tampering, and extortion." Mitchell looked frantically around. He looked at the FBI agents. He looked at his peers. And finally, he looked at Dutch. The biker simply stood there, an immovable mountain of justice wrapped in black leather. Mitchell slowly raised his hands, surrendering his weapon. As the agents slapped the cuffs on his wrists and marched him away in front of the entire school, the playground erupted into stunned murmurs. Elena collapsed to her knees, burying her face in her hands, sobbing. But this time, they were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. Dutch walked over to her and gently offered her a massive, calloused hand. He pulled her to her feet. "It's over, Helena," he said softly. "He's never coming near you or the boy again." Tommy ran over and hugged his mother, then turned to Dutch. He looked up at the giant biker, then looked at the 39 other scary-looking men standing behind him. "Are all of them my uncles now?" Tommy asked innocently. A roar of genuine, booming laughter erupted from the Hells Angels. The tension evaporated, replaced by the deep camaraderie of a brotherhood that had just done exactly what they set out to do. "Yeah, kid," Iron Mike grinned, slapping his heavy leather gloves together. "We're all your uncles. Now who's got the pancakes? I'm starving." To the absolute shock of the West Park Elementary PTA, 40 patched members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club spent the next hour sitting at tiny folding tables, eating syrupy pancakes and swapping stories with a 7-year-old boy. Dutch sat at the head of the table, Tommy right beside him. The boy wasn't looking at the street anymore. He wasn't afraid. For the first time in his life, Tommy knew what it felt like to be completely, untouchably safe. Before the club finally mounted up to leave, Dutch knelt down in front of Tommy one last time. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the green plastic army man. He pressed it back into Tommy's small palm. "You keep this," Dutch said, tapping the winged patch on his own chest. "If you ever need an army again, you know exactly who to call." The world is often quick to judge a book by its worn, leather-bound cover, but true morality rarely wears a pressed suit. That morning, a group of outlaws proved that family isn't defined by blood or the law, but by who shows up when you are terrified and alone. Sometimes, the most fierce protectors are the ones society tells you to fear the most. Desperation breeds crazy courage. A skinny 14-year-old kid walked into a smoke-filled biker bar looking for honest work. He expected rejection. He expected ridicule. What he never saw coming was a thunderous roar of 40 Harley-Davidsons shaking his front porch, changing his family's destiny forever. Lowell, Massachusetts, in late November, is a city that forgets how to be warm. The wind howls off the Merrimack River, biting through thin jackets and rattling loose window panes in the cheaper apartment complexes. On the 3rd floor of one of these crumbling brick buildings lived 14-year-old Leo Caldwell and his mother, Sarah. Their apartment smelled of bleach, stale radiator dust, and the sharp, metallic tang of sickness. Sarah had been battling severe renal failure for over 2 years. The dialysis treatments kept her alive, but they were a brutal, exhausting anchor that drained her energy and their bank account. Before the illness, she had worked double shifts at a diner on Middlesex Street, always making sure Leo had warm boots and a hot dinner. Now, she spent her days confined to a faded floral armchair, wrapped in layers of blankets, her skin pale and translucent. Leo was forced to grow up long before his time. He knew exactly which floorboards creaked. He knew how to water down the milk so it lasted until Thursday. He knew the precise tone of voice the landlord used when an eviction notice was imminent. And this week, that tone had turned from annoyed to definitive. They were 3 months behind on rent. The medical debt was a mountain they could not climb, and the state assistants barely covered Sarah's prescriptions. "I'm sorry, Leo," Sarah whispered, one Tuesday evening, her voice trembling as she stared at the pile of final notice envelopes on the chipped Formica kitchen table. "I never wanted you to have to worry about this. I'm trying to figure it out." "Don't worry, Mom," Leo lied, offering her a brave, practiced smile. "I've got a plan." He didn't have a plan. He had spent the last 3 weeks begging for under-the-table work. He had walked miles, knocking on the back doors of grocery stores, auto shops and restaurants. Every manager took one look at his scrawny frame, his oversized thrift store jacket, and his desperate eyes, and shook their heads. Liability, they said. Too young, they said. Come back in a few years, kid. But a few years was a luxury the Caldwells didn't have. They didn't even have a few weeks. The landlord had given them until Friday to come up with $600, or the locks would be changed. By Wednesday afternoon, the cold was biting, and Leo's desperation had morphed into a reckless, quiet panic. He was walking down a grim industrial stretch of marginal roads near the city outskirts when he saw it, the Broken Spoke. It wasn't just a bar, it was a fortress. The exterior was painted matte black, the windows completely boarded up and covered in faded concert flyers. Out front, lined up with military precision, were a dozen gleaming, heavily customized Harley-Davidson motorcycles. This was the undisputed territory of the local Hells Angels chapter. Everyone in Lowell knew you didn't look at the Broken Spoke too long, you didn't park near it, and you certainly didn't walk through its heavy, steel-reinforced front door unless you wore their patch. Leo stood across the street, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He had heard the rumors. He knew the reputation of the men who drank inside. They were dangerous. They operated by their own set of rules. But as Leo looked at the massive, gleaming chrome engines of the bikes, another thought pushed its way to the forefront of his mind. They have money, and bikes need to be cleaned. His mother's coughing fit from that morning echoed in his ears. The image of the eviction notice burned in his mind. Fear was a luxury for people who had a warm bed to sleep in. Leo pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, took a deep breath that felt like swallowing ice, and crossed the street. The heavy oak door of the Broken Spoke swung open with a slow, ominous groan. The moment Leo stepped over the threshold, the atmosphere hit him like a physical blow. The air was thick, blue with cigarette smoke, and smelled heavily of stale beer, aged leather, and gasoline. Classic rock blared from a jukebox in the corner, but it couldn't entirely drown out the low, rumbling murmur of a dozen deep voices. Every head in the bar turned. The silence that fell was immediate and suffocating. A pool game in the back corner stopped midway through a shot. The bartender, a massive man with a thick beard and a scar running through his left eyebrow, paused with a rag halfway inside a pint glass. Seated at the bar and scattered across the worn booths were men who looked like they were carved from granite and bad intentions. They wore heavy leather cuts, the iconic Death Head logo emblazoned on their backs. Tattoos crawled up their necks and knuckles. Leo stood frozen by the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He suddenly felt incredibly small, acutely aware of his scuffed sneakers and his shaking hands. "You lost, kid," the bartender growled, his voice like gravel grinding together. Before Leo could answer, a mountain of a man stepped out from the shadows near the pool tables. He stood 6'4", his arms corded with thick muscle and covered in faded ink. A heavy silver chain hung from his jeans, clinking softly as he approached. This was Silas Higgins, known to everyone on the street simply as Crow. "Ain't no candy store here, boy," Crow sneered, stepping into Leo's personal space. He smelled of whiskey and motor oil. "You got about 5 seconds to turn around and walk back out that door before I throw you through it." Leo swallowed hard. His knees felt like water, but he dug his fingernails into his palms to ground himself. I'm looking for a job," he managed to say, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat and tried again, louder. "I need a job." A few of the men chuckled. It was a dark, amused sound. "A job?" Crow laughed, looking back at the bar. "You hear that, John? Kid wants to join the payroll." From a large, circular booth in the darkest corner of the room, A figure leaned forward into the dim yellow light. The bar fell dead silent again. This was John Mackey. He wasn't the biggest man in the room, but he exuded a terrifying, quiet authority. His eyes were cold, assessing, and sharp as flint. He was the president of the chapter, a man who had survived decades of turf wars and prison stints. Mackey took a slow drag from a cigar, exhaled a thick cloud of smoke, and gestured for Crow to step aside. "Bring him here," Mackey ordered quietly. Crow grabbed Leo by the back of his jacket and practically carried him to the booth, depositing him roughly on his feet in front of the club president. Several other high-ranking members, including a wiry man named Tommy Gallagher, leaned in to inspect the intruder. "You got some nerve walking in here, boy," Mackey said, his voice dangerously even. "What makes you think we got work for a kid who looks like a strong breeze would break him in half?" "I'm a hard worker," Leo said, forcing himself to maintain eye contact with Mackey, even as his insides twisted with terror. "I can sweep the floors. I can take out the trash. I can wash the bikes. I know how to polish chrome so it doesn't streak. I'll do it for half of what you'd pay anyone else. I need the money." Mackey studied him for a long, agonizing moment. "Why the desperation, kid? Where's your old man? Why ain't he out busting his knuckles for a paycheck?" The question felt like a punch to the gut. "He's dead," Leo said flatly. "Died when I was 3. It's just me and my mum, and she's sick, really sick. Her kidneys are failing. We're getting evicted on Friday if I don't come up with the rent, and we don't have enough for food. I'll do whatever you need done. Please." Tommy Gallagher shifted uncomfortably in his seat, exchanging a brief, unreadable glance with Crow. But Mackey's expression didn't soften. He took another drag of his cigar. "We ain't the Salvation Army, kid," Mackey said coldly. "We don't hand out charity, and we don't hire children to clean our bikes. It's bad for business." Tears of frustration pricked the corners of Leo's eyes, but he furiously blinked them away. He wouldn't cry in front of them. He had gambled his last shred of hope on this terrible place, and he had lost. "Fine," Leo snapped, a sudden spark of anger briefly overriding his fear. "Sorry to waste your time." He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Hold up." Mackey's voice cracked like a whip, halting Leo in his tracks. "What's your name, boy?" Leo looked over his shoulder. "Leo. Leo Caldwell." The silence in the bar seemed to deepen, stretching tight. Tommy Gallagher's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Crow stopped leaning against the pool table and stood up straight. John Mackey didn't move a muscle, but his eyes narrowed imperceptibly. He stared at Leo for a long time, chewing on the end of his cigar. "Caldwell," Mackey repeated softly, tasting the word. "Where do you live, Leo Caldwell?" 442 Elm Street, apartment 3B, Leo said, confused by the sudden shift in the room's energy. "Get out," Mackey ordered, his voice returning to a hard, dismissive bark. "And don't ever walk into this bar again." Crow immediately grabbed Leo by the collar and marched him to the front door, shoving him out onto the freezing sidewalk. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind him, the deadbolt engaging with a loud clack. Leo stood in the biting wind, shivering violently. He had failed. He walked the 2 miles back to his apartment in a daze, the cold seeping into his bones. When he got home, his mother was asleep in her chair, breathing raggedly. Leo covered her with an extra blanket, went to his small room, and buried his face in his pillow. For the first time since his mother got sick, he cried himself to sleep, knowing that Friday would bring the end of their world. He didn't know that 3 miles away, inside the broken spoke, the jukebox had been unplugged, the doors had been locked, and John Mackey had called an emergency meeting at the long wooden table in the back. Thursday was a slow, agonizing crawl toward the executioner's block. The sky over Lowell remained a bruised, heavy, purple, threatening snow that never quite fell. Inside apartment 3B, the radiator clanked uselessly, offering noise but no heat. Leo spent the day packing their meager belongings into cardboard boxes he had salvaged from the alley behind the liquor store. He wrapped his mother's few remaining porcelain figurines in old newspaper, his hands moving mechanically, while his mind raced through 100 failed scenarios. There was no one left to call. No distant relatives, no secret savings account, no sudden miracle waiting in the mail. By the time the sun dipped below the industrial skyline, bathing the apartment in a cold, grey twilight, Leo felt something inside him finally fracture. It was the quiet, devastating realization that he had failed to protect the only person who mattered to him. Sarah watched him from her armchair, her eyes heavy with a mixture of immense love and profound guilt. "Leave the rest, Leo," she rasped, her breathing shallow. "Come sit. We'll go to the city shelter tomorrow. It's not the end of the world, as long as we're together." Leo nodded, though the lump in his throat prevented him from speaking. He sat on the floor beside her chair, resting his head against her arm, listening to the erratic thump of her failing heart. 3 miles away, the atmosphere inside the windowless back room of the Broken Spoke was charged with a different kind of electricity. The heavy oak table was surrounded by the chapter's fully patched members. The air was thick with tension as John Mackey stood at the head of the table, his knuckles resting on the scarred wood. "Caldwell," Mackey said, the name hanging in the stale air like a ghost. He looked around the table, his hard eyes locking onto the older members, the ones who had grey in their beards and old bullet scars under their leathers. "You younger guys don't know the name, but Gallagher knows it. Bobby knows it." Tommy Gallagher, sitting to Mackey's right, slowly took off his sunglasses, revealing eyes that looked suddenly weary. "Arthur," Gallagher muttered reverently. "It's Arthur's kid." Crow, leaning against the cinder-block wall, crossed his massive arms. "Who the hell is Arthur?" Mackey sighed, a rare display of exhaustion from a man who never showed weakness. 12 years ago, before we owned this building, we ran our bikes out of a little independent garage on the south side. The mechanic there was a guy named Arthur Caldwell. He wasn't patched. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a hard-working family man who treated a motorcycle like it was a living, breathing thing. Mackey paused, staring down at the table, his mind dragging him back a decade. "We were at war back then, with a syndicate pushing up from Boston. Nasty business. One night they tracked me and Tommy to Arthur's garage. We were unarmed, waiting on a transmission swap. 3 guys walked in with shotguns. They had me dead to rights, execution style. I didn't even have time to reach for a blade." The room was deathly quiet. Even the younger bikers, usually restless and full of bravado, leaned in to listen. "Arthur was under a chassis," Mackey continued, his voice dropping an octave. "He could have stayed there. He should have stayed there. But he slid out, grabbed a heavy steel torque wrench, and swung it at the shooter. He knocked the barrel away just as the gun went off." Mackey looked up, meeting Crow's eyes. "The spread missed me. It caught Arthur square in the chest. He bled out on his own concrete floor, choking on his own blood, while Tommy and I handled the shooters. Arthur gave up his life, leaving behind a young wife and a toddler, so I could stand here today." A heavy, solemn silence blanketed the room. In the world of the Hells Angels, debts of blood and honor were absolute. They transcended time, law, and reason. "We gave the widow, Sarah, a massive envelope of cash after the funeral," Gallagher chimed in, his voice rough. "Told her to take the boy and get out of the neighborhood for her own safety. We kept our distance, so the syndicate wouldn't connect her to us. We thought she moved out of state. We thought she was set. Instead, she's 3 miles away, dying of kidney failure. Mackie snarled, a sudden fierce anger radiating from him. And Arthur Caldwell's boy just walked into my bar, shivering in a thrift store coat, begging to scrub toilets because he's getting thrown out on the street tomorrow. Mackie slammed his fist onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Get the treasurer," Mackie ordered, his eyes blazing. "Empty the safe, and tell every patched member in the city to have their bikes fueled and lined up out front by 7 a.m. Nobody sleeps in tomorrow." Friday morning arrived with the biting chill of a true New England winter. Frost coated the windows of apartment 3B. At exactly 8 a.m., heavy, impatient footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by 3 sharp, aggressive raps on the door. Leo's stomach plummeted. He walked to the door and unlocked it. Standing in the hallway was Mr. Gable, the property manager. He was a tall, severe man in a cheap trench coat, clutching a clipboard and looking incredibly annoyed. Behind him stood 2 burly men, carrying heavy-duty trash bags. "Time's up, kid," Gable said, pushing past Leo without waiting for an invitation. He looked around the bleak, half-packed living room with profound distaste. "I told you, 8 a.m. sharp. The locksmith is on his way. You and your mother need to vacate the premises immediately." Sarah struggled to sit up in her chair, her breathing labored, panic flashing in her pale eyes. "Mr. Gable, please. Just a few more days. It's freezing outside. I'm waiting on a call from the State Assistance Office." "I don't care if you're waiting on a call from the President of the United States," Gable snapped coldly. "You're 3 months in arrears. This is a business, not a charity ward. Boys, start putting their boxes in the hall." Leo felt a surge of blind, protective rage. He stepped between Gable and his mother, grabbing a heavy wooden baseball bat he had left leaning against the radiator. His hands were shaking, but his jaw was set. "Get out," Leo shouted, his voice cracking but loud. "Don't touch our stuff. Just give me until tonight." Gable laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. He gestured to the 2 men. "Grab the bat from the kid and get them out of here." The men took a step forward. Leo raised the bat, terrified but prepared to swing. Then the floorboards began to vibrate. It started as a low, distant hum, like an impending earthquake. Within seconds, the hum escalated into a deafening, guttural roar that rattled the frosted windows and vibrated through the soles of their shoes. It was a mechanical symphony of overwhelming power. Gable frowned, looking toward the window. The 2 movers froze. The noise was impossible to ignore. It sounded like a fleet of heavy bombers was landing directly on Elm Street. Leo backed up slowly toward the window, the bat still gripped in his hands, and peered through a gap in the blinds. His breath hitched. The entire street below was a sea of black leather and gleaming chrome. 40 Harley-Davidsons were arranged in a staggered militaristic formation, entirely blocking traffic in both directions. The riders were cutting their engines in unison, creating a sudden, ringing silence that was somehow more intimidating than the roar had been. Neighbors were peering out from behind their curtains, terrified. Pedestrians on the sidewalk had completely vanished. Leo watched in stunned disbelief as John Mackie dismounted his custom road glide. Behind him, Crow, Tommy Gallagher, and a dozen other massive, heavily tattooed men climbed off their bikes. They didn't look up. They simply moved with grim, unified purpose toward the front doors of the apartment building. "What the hell is going on down there?" Gable muttered, suddenly looking very pale. A minute later, the hallway outside apartment 3B filled with the heavy thud of leather boots. The door, which had been left slightly ajar, was kicked open so hard it hit the drywall with a resounding crack. The 2 burly movers instantly backed away, pressing themselves against the wall. Gable stood frozen in the center of the room. John Mackey stepped into the apartment. He looked larger, more imposing in the cramped space than he had in the bar. Crow and Gallagher flanked him, their expressions murderous. 6 more bikers filled the hallway behind them, completely blocking the exit. Mackey's cold eyes scanned the room, taking in the packed boxes, the baseball bat in Leo's trembling hands, and finally, the frail woman in the armchair. His gaze softened for a fraction of a second before snapping to Gable. "You the landlord?" Mackey asked, his voice low and dangerously calm. I'm the property manager," Gable stammered, all his previous arrogance evaporating. He clutched his clipboard like a shield. "Listen, I don't want any trouble. This is a legal eviction." "Shut up," Crow growled, stepping forward. Gable immediately clamped his mouth shut. Mackey reached inside his leather cut and pulled out a thick, bound stack of $100 bills. He tossed it casually. The heavy stack hit Gable squarely in the chest, forcing him to catch it against his clipboard. "That's $10,000, Mackey said flatly. "That covers their back rent, and it covers their rent for the next 5 years. You don't evict them. You don't send them late notices. In fact, if the heat goes out in this apartment for more than 10 minutes, or if a single light bulb burns out in that hallway, I'm going to send Crow here to have a very personal conversation with you. Do we understand each other?" Gable stared at the stack of cash, his hands shaking violently. He looked at Mackey, then at Crow, who smiled a terrifying, toothy smile. Yes, sir. Absolutely understood." "Then get the hell out of my sight," Mackey ordered. Gable and his 2 men practically tripped over themselves, scrambling out the door, squeezing past the wall of leather-clad bikers in the hallway. Once they were gone, the tension in the room shifted. Mackey took off his leather gloves and walked slowly over to Sarah. He knelt beside her armchair, completely ignoring the grime on the floor. "Sarah," he said softly. Sarah stared at him, bewildered, clutching her blanket. Do I know you?" "You don't," Mackey said, "but I knew Arthur. I knew him very well." Sarah gasped, a tear slipping down her pale cheek. "Arthur, he saved my life, Sarah," Mackey said, his voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. 12 years ago, he took a bullet meant for me. I wouldn't be breathing if it wasn't for your husband. We thought you moved away. We didn't know you were struggling. If we had known, you would have never gone hungry for a single day." Leo slowly lowered the baseball bat, his mind spinning. The men he had terrified himself to meet yesterday were standing in his living room, treating his mother like royalty. Mackey stood up and turned to Leo. He walked over and firmly clamped a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "You've got your old man's grit, kid. Walking into the broken spoke took stones." Mackey looked him dead in the eye. "You asked for a job. You've got one. We run a legitimate custom shop on the east side. You start tomorrow. You'll sweep floors, wash bikes, and learn to turn a wrench the right way. We pay $20 an hour." Leo's eyes widened. "Really? But what about school?" "You stay in school," Mackey said sternly, pointing a finger at him. "You keep your grades up, or Crow kicks your ass. You work weekends and afternoons." Mackey looked back at Sarah. "And we've got a private doctor who handles things for the club. He's the best nephrologist in the state. He'll be here this afternoon to look at your charts. We're going to get you better care, Sarah." Leo dropped the bat. The crushing weight that had been sitting on his chest for 2 years finally lifted. He looked at the terrifying men filling his apartment, seeing past the tattoos and the leather, realizing they had brought him the one thing he had entirely run out of: hope. The roar of engines fading down Elm Street that morning was not a sound of intimidation, but a truly strange, thunderous lullaby. Leo Caldwell, a young boy pushed to the absolute brink found salvation in the most dangerous men in the city. They didn't simply pay an overdue debt. They fiercely forged a brand new family. Sometimes the darkest shadows hide the fiercest protectors, and angels ride heavy steel motorcycles. 700 hardened outlaws stood in dead, suffocating silence. In the center of the dust-choked Mojave compound sat a paralyzed $2.5 million masterpiece. A 22-year-old runaway with grease-stained hands gripped a wrench, knowing one wrong turn of the titanium bolt wouldn't just strip the engine, it would cost him his life. The Mojave sun was a relentless, hammering anvil, baking the earth until the air above the asphalt rippled with heat distortion. It was high noon at the Iron Summit, a highly classified, heavily guarded desert compound owned by the most formidable chapter of the Hells Angels. Over 700 patched members from across the globe had descended upon the valley, their leather vests coated in a fine layer of white alkali dust. They were gathered for a single, defining event: the unveiling and inaugural ride of the Sovereign. The Sovereign wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a rolling monument, a mechanized bank vault, and an artifact of outlaw royalty. Commissioned 3 years prior by the chapter's ruthless president, Silas Montgomery, the bike had been the final masterpiece of the late Cole Briggs, a legendary custom fabricator who had taken his most fiercely guarded mechanical secrets to the grave. The Sovereign was appraised at an astronomical $2.5 million. Its frame was laced with raw, conflict-free diamonds embedded beneath layers of translucent candy apple red paint, and its engine block had been machined from a single, solid billet of weapons-grade titanium. It was a terrifyingly beautiful machine, engineered to produce a thunderous 250 horsepower. But right now, the most expensive motorcycle in outlaw history was nothing more than a lifeless paperweight. Silas Montgomery, a man whose reputation for violence was as legendary as the bike he straddled, turned the custom-milled ignition key. 700 bikers held their breath, waiting for the trademark earth-shaking roar. Instead, there was a sickening, metallic crunch. It was the sound of internal devastation, followed by a high-pitched mechanical whine, and then a dead, absolute stall. A collective murmur rippled through the sea of leather and denim. Silas's face, usually carved from granite, contorted with a fury so dark it seemed to drop the ambient temperature of the desert. He slammed his fist against the titanium handlebars. "Dutch! Wyatt!" Silas roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Get out here! Now!" The crowd parted instantly as two of the club's most seasoned mechanics sprinted forward. Dutch, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard, and Wyatt, younger but with a decade of experience under his belt, dropped to their knees on the burning tarmac. They ripped open their tool rolls, sweat pouring from their foreheads, stinging their eyes. They had precisely 10 minutes to find the problem before Silas's embarrassment turned into lethal retribution. 30 yards away, watching from the oppressive shadows of a corrugated steel supply shed, stood Leo Cassidy. Leo didn't belong here. He was 22, a runaway from the south side of Chicago, fleeing a disastrous $50,000 debt owed to a ruthless loan shark named Carmine Rossi. To save his late grandfather's failing auto shop, Leo had borrowed from the wrong people, lost everything, and hopped a freight train west. He had ended up stranded in the Mojave, taken in by the club solely to sweep floors, scrub oil pans, and take out the trash in exchange for a cot and a roof for where Rossi's enforcers couldn't find him. But Leo possessed a secret. He was a savant. Raised by a grandfather who built race engines for a living, Leo could diagnose a misfire by ear from a block away. He understood the heartbeat of a combustion engine better than he understood human beings. For the next 15 minutes, Leo watched in agonizing silence as Dutch and Wyatt tore off the Sovereign's primary cover, frantically checking spark plugs, fuel lines, and the electronic control unit. "The ECU is throwing ghost codes, boss," Dutch stammered, his hands trembling violently as he held a diagnostic scanner. "The fuel pump is priming, but the crank won't turn. It's completely seized. It's dead. Cole Briggs built this engine to outlast a nuclear strike," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. He stepped off the bike, unbuckling the heavy leather belt around his waist. "And you're telling me, in front of 700 of my brothers, that my $2.5 million bike is dead?" Wyatt took a step back, raising his hands. "Silas, we need a machine shop. We need an engine hoist. We can't fix this in the dirt." Silas wrapped the leather belt around his knuckles. The 700 bikers formed a tight, suffocating ring around the broken machine